Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast. My name is Eric Rostad, and I am recording this episode in my library in Franklin, Tennessee. Behind me, you see the books that are part of this project. I started just kind of reading 52 random books each year, and then I shifted in 2023 to reading through the immortal books. Many people call these the great books. I like to refer to them as the immortal books. And what I did is I made a list of 200 authors, and I'm just reading their works in chronological order. I've set aside the next 40 years to do this project. That leaves a lot of time for just different pathways to explore. But the main goal is to read the greatest books ever written by these 200 authors. And where I am in that process right now, chronologically, is with the Greeks. And so I've spent a lot of time reading Homer, the tragedies. I read all the tragedies. I read the comedies. I read Greek history. And now I am on Greek philosophy. And so last year I started reading the dialogues of Plato. And something I realized very quickly on was that I needed help. I was having trouble understanding these dialogues and what Plato was referring to, who he was referring to. And if you look at his dialogues, a lot of them are named after earlier Greek philosophers. So what I did is I went back in time and spent 3 months reading these early Greek philosophers and sophists. And I learned about their ideas, I learned about who they were, their first principles and things that they believed in. And now I'm returning to Plato. And so my first foray back into the dialogues of Plato is with Philebus. And this is the dialogue I'm going to cover in today's episode, which is number 292 of the Books of Titans podcast. I'm going to be reading mostly from, or actually all from this Penguin Classics edition that is translated by Robin Waterfield. I also referenced this version, which is Plato's Complete Works. And so what I've been doing with these dialogues, this is my 10th dialogue of Plato that I've read, is I'll start with this Complete Works version. And it's huge, it's a monster to carry around, but it has all the dialogues, and my plan is just to read through this entire book. But then if I have trouble, which I usually do, in understanding different aspects of the dialogues, I will get another version. And it's either the Penguin Classics or the Oxford World's Classics versions of these dialogues. What's great about these that doesn't necessarily happen in this one is that there's very little introduction or notes in this Complete Works, but there is a huge introduction here, and there are a ton of notes in the back of these versions. So I find these helpful just to kind of dig in deeper, get more of a basis for the dialogue and when it was written, just kind of more information about it. So I want to take us through this particular dialogue and kind of the high points of the dialogue and what I learned from it. And just to start, this is one of the last dialogues that Plato wrote. He wrote it in the late 350s BC. And so this is after he's written many of his more famous dialogues like the Republic. And this one asks a simple question: what is the good life? Or what does the best life contain? So in these dialogues, we'll have kind of a central question that's being asked. Plato will then go all sorts of directions on attempting to not necessarily answer the question, but to ask questions that make you think about the question. And he usually does that through this man, Socrates. And Socrates was Plato's teacher. Socrates never wrote anything down, but Plato wrote all these dialogues. Almost everything he wrote has survived, which is really incredible. If we look at the Greek tragedy writers, very few of their tragedies have survived. But with Plato, we have most of his surviving works. And so what we have in this case is a dialogue that has 3 characters in it, and they are talking about this question: what is the good life? So let me introduce the characters. The one is Socrates, and then we have Protarchus and Philebus. Now, we are entering this particular dialogue right in the middle of it, and that's kind of a neat thing. Like with Homer's Iliad, we're entering the story in the middle of the story. There's not like in the beginning. The beginning already happened. We're in the middle of it. Same with this dialogue. And what Philebus and Socrates have been talking about is this question of the good life. And what Philebus has put forward is that the good life consists solely of pleasure, the seeking after pleasure. This time of the year in May with graduations happening, you hear a lot of parents saying, I just want my kid to be happy. If they go to college, I just want them to study something that makes them happy. Or if they're going on to work, I hope they're happy. But what does that mean? Like what would make that person happy? What is the good life that would ensure happiness in their life? And so what Philebus is saying is that it is pleasure. And so he's taking the view of the hedonist who is pursuing pleasure, and that is life's main goal. Let's always be happy. Let's always have good things going on. Let's always seek after pleasure. Socrates is taking a different view, and he says what we should seek after is wisdom, knowledge. And so let me read. This is just one of the very first comments by Socrates in this particular dialogue. So let me read this. Well, Philebus says that for all living creatures, the good is enjoyment, pleasure, delight, and whatever is compatible with them. But my contention, and again, this is Socrates speaking, but my contention is that there are not the good, but that reason, intellect, memory, not to mention their cognates, correct belief, and true calculation, are far better than pleasure for all creatures capable of attaining them. They offer the greatest benefit for all those who now or in the future are able to attain them. And I'll stop reading there. So this sets up the dialogue. What happens is Protarchus is taking the place of Philebus in this dialogue. And in the introduction, there's mention that one of the reasons for this is that Philebus, as a hedonist, is not going to care about a rational idea. He's all about the senses. He's all about feeling good. And so if somebody comes to him with an argument of why pleasure may not be the main thing to seek after in life, he may not be able to receive that because he is all about pleasure. So it's kind of an interesting idea here where you almost need a middleman to take the place of Philebus, and that's who we have in this character, Protarchus. So Protarchus is also taking that view that pleasure is the main thing, the highest good that we should seek after. Socrates, on the other hand, is saying no, wisdom. But then Socrates asks, he says this, what if we find a better state? If it turns out to be more akin to pleasure, wouldn't it follow that the life of pleasure would beat the life of reason, but both would be defeated by the life whose property this state secretly is? And so what Socrates is doing there is, okay, we're trying to find the best life. Is it through pleasure or is it through wisdom? And he says, what if there's something else? What if there's a third state that's even better than one of those two? And so what this dialogue is trying to do is to rank these. What is the best life? Is it pleasure first and then wisdom later, or is wisdom on top of pleasure for the good life? And what Socrates does right away is says, well, what if there's a third option? What if there's sort of like a mixture between these two things, between pleasure and wisdom? So from there, what Socrates does is he separates these two ideas. He separates pleasure and the good. And for the sake of argument, what if we ban wisdom from the life of pleasure and vice versa? Can we do that? So then he goes through this thought experiment. Can you have pleasure without wisdom or knowledge or memory? Or any of those things that he listed right at the beginning of the dialogue. And what you quickly realize is that you can't. You need, if you're just having pleasure, how do you know that you're having pleasure if you're unable to think about it? If it's totally separate, it's kind of an absurd argument, but Protarchus and Philebus are saying that pleasure is the only thing, it's the only good. And so you could just go 100% pleasure. And what Plato is trying to show through Socrates here is, well, actually you can't, because you need memory to remember the pleasure. You need memory of like a past pleasure to know that this thing that you're about to do is also going to be pleasurable. But you also need to be thinking about the pleasure to know that it is a pleasure. And so there must be a mixture of these things just right off the bat. And so that's what he's showing kind of right at the beginning here. Then where Socrates takes the questioning is in the argument is to look at things in general. So he says this: let's divide everything that now exists in the universe into two, or rather, if you have no objection, into three classes. Later on, he says, then let's assume that there are two of the classes and that the third is a unit formed by the mixture of them. And then later, because I think I need yet another class, a fourth one, I want you to count the cause of the mixing of the first two classes with each other as a fourth class over above the other three. So again, we are trying to determine the kinds of things, and from that, then we'll tie these to pleasure and wisdom. And so what Socrates just identified is four different kinds of things, or four different ways to divide everything that now exists in the universe. And those four things are this: the unlimited. So this is things that don't have a limit. It might be hot or cold, more or less, but you've got this idea of the unlimited, the infinite. The second is the limited, things that kind of put those into a limit, whether it's a ratio or a number or some sort of a measure. The third thing is a mixture of those two things. So you've got unlimited things that are being limited. And then the fourth thing is some sort of a cause that causes these things to be mixed. So where within those four things, the unlimited, the limited, the mixture, and the cause, Plato then asks, where does pleasure fit in to this? And here's the question. So far, so good. But what about your life? And this is Socrates speaking. What about your life, Philebus, which consists of pleasure, with no admixture of anything else? In which of the classes we've mentioned would be right to put it? Before you reply, first answer another question. But let's focus on that one question. Where would pleasure fit in this? And where pleasure fits is in that first item of unlimited. You can't measure pleasure. And therefore, with the goal of this dialogue being to rank the good between pleasure and wisdom, if you can't rank pleasure, if it's part of this unlimited, you can't. We've got to keep going, because we can't rank pleasure in that sense. So let's keep going. Here's kind of the conclusion Socrates comes up with a few pages later. Let's bear in mind then that the following facts about them both. Intellect was found to be of the same family as the cause, and may be said to belong to that class, but pleasure was found to be indeterminate in itself, and to belong to the class in which by itself there is not and never will be any definite beginning, middle, or end. End quote. So that's the conclusion. We can't measure it, so we can't rank it. He says the intellect, the wisdom, knowledge, and all that can be found in the same family as the cause, which was the fourth item in that list, but pleasure is in that first item. So from there, it just kind of goes to reiterate that that reason is required for the enjoyment of pleasures. There has to be a mixture of both knowledge, wisdom, and pleasure as part of this good life. So that's kind of the next step he takes. And here's are some things Socrates says. Because it shows that every living creature always strives for the opposite of his present state, the tendency towards the opposite to the present state demonstrates, I think, that there is memory of the various opposites to the various current states. Therefore, by showing that it is memory that provides the impulse towards the object of desire, the argument is declaring that all drive, desire, and authority in every living creature belong to the soul. I'll stop reading there, but just, this element of there needing to be a mixture. There needs to be memory in the pursuit of pleasure. Now we're going to skip ahead quite a bit, and we're going to go to where Socrates defines different types of pleasure. Again, Philebus and Protarchus, they think there's just one kind of pleasure, and all pleasures are the same, and all pleasures are good. And if you just seek after pleasure, this one category of pleasure, that's the good life. And Socrates is saying, no, we need to distinguish between the types of pleasure. And so that's what Socrates does next here. He says this: well then, I don't think we need to continue with other examples of this phenomenon. This one entitles us to infer that a tiny little pleasure is, if uncontaminated by pain, always more pleasant, truer, and finer than a large amount. And I'll end the quote there. So pleasure is not just one. What Socrates says is that there's a better form of pleasure, and he defines these in terms of kind of true or false pleasures, and he divides these into 4 different areas. Now, the first false pleasure is a belief in the wrong. And a modern day example of that could be a belief in the lottery, that you're going to win the lottery. And so you buy this ticket and you think you're going to become a millionaire the next day. It's a belief in the wrong thing. The second type of false pleasure. But you might get pleasure out of buying that lottery ticket, but it's a false pleasure because your chances of winning are very low. The next type of false pleasure is one where there's a bad measuring. And this can best be thought of in terms of the distance to the pleasure, between the pleasure and the pain. And so an example would be one more beer during the night. And that might feel really good during the night. The next morning, it's not going to feel so good. And so there's this distance between the pleasure and the pain. That is a kind of false pleasure because you're getting pleasure, but it's coming at the cost of later pain. The third kind of false pleasure is pain relief. And this is where things get absurd in the hedonist argument for the good. So if you're having pain, there's tremendous pleasure in relieving that pain. I mean, just even a basic example of if you're thirsty, if you get some water, that is pleasurable. You're relieving that pain. But it's a false pleasure, and let me just skip ahead to the absurdity of this. So hedonism is turning out to have some pretty absurd consequences, Socrates. And that is Protarchus speaking. And the reason it has absurd consequences is because if you have more pain, you're going to have more pleasure. But the hedonist, the one seeking after pleasure, does not want pain. Yet, some of your greatest pleasures are going to come at the opposite side of the worst pain. Like if you have a terrible disease, it feels so good when you start feeling good again, doesn't it? That's a great pleasure, but it comes at a tremendous pain. So this puts the hedonist in a difficult position where they can't admit that they want pain, but pain often leads to some of our greatest pleasures. So that's the third false type of pleasure. Now the fourth type of pleasure is the good one, and this is where Socrates talks of this as a pure pleasure, and it does not come at the expense of pain. There's no pain involved, and this could be a pleasure of a blue sky or the perfect day outside or a great meal or something like that. There's not, or hearing a wonderful song. There's not this pain that's associated, but it's a pure pleasure in that it is unmixed with pain. So after defining these pleasures, Socrates goes back and closes out the dialogue by ranking everything. So that was, again, remember the goal of this dialogue was to rank the good life. Did it consist of pleasure and then wisdom, or wisdom and pleasure, and then was there a mixture of those things? And so what Socrates does at the very end here is actually gives us a ranking of 5 different things. And so this is really interesting. Again, remember we started off with pleasure versus wisdom or knowledge. So let me read something really quickly first about false pleasures. And this is Protarchus speaking. But as you know, pleasures, and I think this is particularly true of the greatest pleasures, involve the person experiencing them in a ridiculous, if not utterly repulsive display. This makes us self-conscious, and we keep these pleasures as secret as possible, reserving all such activities for the hours of darkness, as if they should not be exposed to the light of day. Again, this is Protarchus now, who is talking about some of these false pleasures and just even having to hide some of these pleasures. Does that coincide with the good life? So here is Socrates at the very end. He gives us a ranking of 5 levels of good. So let's call this the ladder of goods. The first thing we have is, let me read this, that goodness has somehow been caught above in moderation in what is moderate, ordered, and so on. So the first thing is moderate or ordered goods, and this is where balance comes into play. The second is this. Then again, its second domain is proportion, beauty, perfection, sufficiency, and everything of this kind. The third is intellect, and the fourth is knowledge. The fifth is what are called pure pleasures. So from those original two, where we had wisdom and pleasure, wisdom shows up in the third spot. So it's not even, Socrates doesn't put wisdom at the first spot. He puts that in the third spot with intellect and the cause. He puts pleasure as the fifth item on the list. And again, this is from the highest to the lowest in terms of what relates to the good life. Pleasure shows up the fifth spot, but he distinguishes the pleasures and does not list those false pleasures in this ranking of five. This is only the pure pleasures, those pleasures that did not have pain mixed in with them. So I wanted to give an example, like using these five items of rank in the ladder of goods. This past week, I spent in Oxford University in the UK, and I went in one of the libraries that I've wanted to get in for like 26 years. And so it's called the Duke Humphreys Library. Just to give you an idea, and it was awesome because I carried this with me to the UK, this huge Plato complete works. And when I got into that library, I opened up my work of Plato here, and what was inside but this bookmark. And I've been using this bookmark since I studied in Oxford in the year 2000. So for the past 26 years, I've had this bookmark in my books, and it's of the Bodleian Library, and it's taken in the Duke Humphreys Library. And so that is where I was reading and studying. And so I've wanted to be in this library for the past 26 years. It's been a big desire of mine to get in there. And so let me walk through what this library is in terms of these five things. Again, we've got the ordered kind of balance. We've got beauty. We've got intellect, knowledge, and then pure pleasure. So for the Duke Humphreys Library, the library just in itself, all its glory, the balance of that room with the mahogany shelves, the old books, the smell, everything about that is that first item of you have an ordered, something that is ordered. The second thing of beauty, this is like me walking into that library and just being amazed at the beauty of all that is ordered and proportioned of that library. It's a perfect library. It's a perfect spot. Third is intellect in the cause. So this involves the designers of that library. I don't know if that was Duke Humphreys himself, if he just put up the money or if he helped design it or what. But this is like the architect of that library, the cause of it, the intellect. Again, this is the wisdom. This is from the beginning of the dialogue, the wisdom of where to rank. This is who caused the mixing of all these elements for this library to appear as it does. The fourth is skills and knowledge. And this is the building itself, the library, and maintaining it, dusting it, keeping it clean, keeping it ordered. That's the fourth level of ranking of what causes the good life. And then the fifth thing is the pure pleasure. This is my experience walking into the library, just the pure pleasure of that. It was not mixed with pain. It was just, I walked in and I was just amazed. So that's kind of an example from a recent thing in my life of just these ranked of what is the good life consist of. And it's that it's ordered, it's beautiful, there's an intellect, there's a cause behind it, there's knowledge, and then there's this pure pleasure and kind of the ranking of the order of those. Socrates ends up and he says, subsequently it did turn out, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that neither of them is sufficient. So you can't just have a life of pure pleasure, just seeking after pleasure. You can't do that. It's impossible. You can't just do wisdom as well. You can't just live a life of only seeking after wisdom without any pleasure. It's a dry life. You don't want that either. You neither of those two things in and of themselves are sufficient. There needs to be a mixture. What's great is that the end of it also leaves us kind of in the middle. So Protarchus says, or Socrates asks, do you mean I can go now? And Protarchus says, there's still a little unfinished business, Socrates. I'm sure you won't give up before us. So I'll remind you of what's outstanding. And so we don't get the rest of that dialogue, but we just kind of get to think of what all that means. I like to close out these episodes just with one thing. What's the one thing that stuck out to me the most about this dialogue? What's the one thing that I always hope to remember from this dialogue? And for Philebus, the one thing that I hope to remember is that the good life, it's not about getting more pleasure or more wisdom, but it's getting the balance correct between those two things. And that's just a really important idea for happiness in general. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting more of things, more pleasure, more wisdom, more knowledge, but it's having a right balance. And we find that so much in life, don't we? Just the importance of balance. And that's what comes about in this dialogue. And I think it's really important for our time. And it's a great way to talk about those, to look at the person who thinks that pleasure is the greatest good. Flesh that out. What does that look like? What if you just pursued pleasure all the time? Well, the greatest pleasure that you can have oftentimes is related to the greatest pain. So do you want to go through the greatest pain to get to the greatest pleasure? Kind of thinking through things in that way. Or do you want to just pursue wisdom or knowledge for your whole life? That would be dry. So what's the proper balance? What's the proper mixture of pleasure and knowledge for the good life? And that's kind of the main. That's my takeaway from this dialogue, and I think it's a good one. So I'm going to close out there. I will be reading other dialogues. The next one I'm just reading on the back of this is the order in which the dialogues are. So I just read Philebus. The next one is Symposium, which is one of Plato's more famous ones. So I'm going to read that next. Then I'm leading a reading group in Franklin, Tennessee here, and what we're going to be reading is Plato's Apology. So I read that earlier, but I'm going to go back to this one again and prepare for that reading group. So that'll be coming up next. But I hope to cover Symposium. Again, I'll probably read it here first and then get another version and read that and then share what I'm learning. Just so you know, I want to reiterate this. And especially if you're kind of approaching Plato for the first time, they are very hard. Maybe you can read them and you're brilliant and you just get them. I'm struggling through these. I'm reading through them many times. I'm thinking about them. I'm taking notes. Let me just show you my notes. How I approach these dialogues. I took 4 pages of notes just on this dialogue, and let me show you. Like just as I'm going through it, I'm trying to just write down some of the main ideas. I started having certain signals and signs for things like goals, someone's contention, or a conclusion. So goals, Socrates would over and over say, okay, for the next part of this dialogue, here is our goal. We're trying to answer this question. So I'd put a certain mark next to that just so I could look through my notes and say, okay, throughout the dialogue, here's what Socrates is trying to do, what Plato's trying to do through Socrates. A contention, here is what Philebus thinks, or Protarchus thinks, or here's what Socrates thinks. This is their contention on this question. So I can easily see what each person thinks about the goal for that section. And then a conclusion, sometimes, not often, but sometimes Plato will actually give us a conclusion, some sort of an answer that leads on to the next set of questions. So I'll write all those out. And so I took 3 pages of notes here, and then on the final page just kind of tried to put all of those things together and really highlighted the frameworks. So those those two things that we start off with, the four kinds of things, the true and false pleasures, and then the final ranking, the ladder of goods. Again, it takes me a while to get this, but what really helps is kind of writing it out, seeing it visually. I'm also wondering if even like on some of the other dialogues, if I try to draw pictures of things, it might help as well. But use whatever you need to help you with Plato, but know that it might be difficult. You may need to read these things multiple times, like I've had to do, but it's worth it. And these dialogues are fascinating, and I'm really enjoying them. So I'm going to keep going through the complete works of Plato. I think there are 35 dialogues or so. So I'm 10 in now. So I'll be doing this for a while more, but it's been an absolute delight. Thank you for listening. Follow Books of Titans on Instagram or Twitter. It's just at Books of Titans. And I have a Substack. So this is where the podcast comes from. You can leave comments and notes on this particular episode. So if something stuck out to you that you want to comment on, or if you have a question or a correction on something I said, please do that on Substack, and so everyone can see that. I am here to learn. So the more that there's conversation and feedback, the more I learn, the more that we all learn along with this dialogue. I'll be back next week with either the symposium or something else, and look forward to seeing you then. Until then, keep learning, keep reading, and keep listening. I'm out.